There was a faint, waxy smell of lilies and boiled ham in the parish hall that Friday evening, the sort of scent that only arises from an English church function attended by more women than men. Mrs. Harbottle, who had taken charge of both the raffle and the vicar's table centrepiece, was feeling quite pleased with herself until the candle on said centrepiece decided to perform something rather unchristian. It had spelled a name, at least. That was how Miss Larkin described it afterward. Formed the very letters in the wax, Inspector, neat as anything, as if someone unseen had warmed it from within. At the time, however, few people noticed. The ladies' committee was midway through the second raffle, a rather unpopular one, involving chutneys and macrame, and only old Mr. Follett, seated near the tea-urn, had looked over at the flickering votive by the dais and muttered, "Well, that's peculiar," before returning to his Battenberg. The parish fundraising supper was an annual event, full of polite chatter and the slow rustle of moral superiority. The townspeople of Flaxborough prided themselves on their civility, and on how efficiently they could discuss one another when backs were turned. But the candle changed that. For the following morning, Mrs. Harbottle, still somewhat unsettled, went to the church early to check on the decorations. The name, she said, was still there, faintly embedded in the run of wax down the brass holder. It read, Miles. Now, the problem with that was simple. There had been no one named Miles in Flaxborough for 17 years. The last had been Miles Gedden, a solicitor of fair reputation and peculiar hobbies, who disappeared one foggy autumn night and been the subject of whispered theories ever since. Officially, he had gone to Spain. Unofficially, he had gone the way of the ledger books, as the late Inspector Bullimore once put it, which was to say, quietly and unaccountably missing. By mid-morning, the story of the candle had already passed through the invisible wires of Flaxborough's social telegraph. Mrs. Harbottle told Mrs. Beasley, who told Mrs. Beasley's lodger, who told half of Market Street. By the time it reached the attention of Inspector Purbright, it had grown from a strange shape in the wax to a ghostly warning of a man murdered and buried beneath the vestry. Purbright had heard stranger things, though not many before luncheon. He found Mrs. Harbottle in the vestry, flapping a lace handkerchief with unnecessary energy. She was a woman who believed firmly in both divine order and the importance of being seen to maintain it. "I know it sounds absurd, Inspector," she began, before he'd spoken a word, "but you can see it yourself." "It's right there," he leaned in. The candle, a thick, cream-coloured affair with a gold paper cross, had indeed melted into curious shapes. The word Miles was visible if one squinted and ignored one's sense of proportion. "It is certainly suggestive," Purbright said mildly. "The wax, Mrs. Harbottle, is a most impressionable substance. It tends to take the shape of what people expect to see." She looked wounded. "But surely you can't deny the coincidence." "Not after all that happened with Mr. Gedden." Purbright smiled. "Coincidences, Mrs. Harbottle, are much like moths. They appear wherever there's too much light." She didn't seem to find that comforting. By afternoon, Sergeant Love had already been sent to take a look, though Purbright privately suspected the sergeant's main interest lay in Miss Larkin's lemon drizzle cake, not supernatural wax phenomena. Still, procedure was procedure. A note was made, a photograph taken. The candle itself, or what remained of it, was carried to the station, wrapped solemnly in brown paper and string like an invalid's parcel. By tea-time, 2 new details had emerged. First, that the candle had been provided not by the church, but by the florist's shop on Market Street, one of several decorative items arranged at the request of Mrs. Harbottle herself. And second, that the florist, a young man named Kenneth Parry, had recently taken lodgings in the very house once occupied by the late, or perhaps simply absent, Mr. Miles Gedden. That last fact gave Inspector Purbright pause. not alarm. Precisely, Flaxborough had long been a home for the gently coincidental. But pause, a small mental tug like a loose thread on a seemingly tidy jumper. He said nothing of it to Sergeant Love, who was already suggesting the whole thing was probably just a drip pattern, sir. From the heat. Purbright only nodded and turned the brown paper parcel thoughtfully in his hands. Somewhere within it, faint and soft, a word once whispered had hardened into wax, he wondered, in the quiet manner of a man who never showed all his thoughts at once. Whether it had remembered more than just a name. By the following Monday, the candle had achieved a kind of local sainthood. It was discussed in the bakery queue, mentioned reverently in the hairdressers, and dissected, with theological precision, at the Bar of the Feathers. By the time the Flaxborough Citizen went to print, the story had ascended from mere curiosity to a near-religious omen. The headline read, "Mystery Message from Beyond." Miles' name appears in parish candle, and below it, in smaller type, "Police make routine inquiry, no cause for alarm." It was, of course, precisely the sort of phrase that guaranteed alarm. Miss Lucilla Larkin, who had been among the first to spot the wax inscription, was not one to let such recognition fade. She had, in her youth, been denied the title of Miss Flaxborough Rose by a margin of 2 votes. Both, she suspected, the result of Mrs. Harbottle's lobbying, and she had never forgiven obscurity since. By Tuesday morning, she had told the story at least 6 times, each with slight embellishment. In one version, the candle flickered unnaturally blue. In another, the name had glowed. She even hinted to Mrs. Parry, the florist's mother, that it might be a message from the other side, particularly for Kenneth. Mrs. Parry, a small, nervous woman with a permanent expression of polite terror, did not find that comforting. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, was doing what he always did best, listening. He sat in his office, not reading the Citizen, but letting Sergeant Love summarize it with the enthusiasm of a man who secretly enjoyed the town's melodrama. They're saying, "Sir, that it's a sign about that solicitor fellow who disappeared, Miles Gedden. Some people reckon he's buried under the old vestry tiles. Mrs. Beasley says her late husband heard a knocking once during choir practice." Purbright raised an eyebrow. Mr. Beasley's experience of knocking, Sergeant, was primarily that of falling asleep during sermons. Love grinned. "Aye, sir." Still, Mrs. Harbottle swears the wax spelt it clean as anything. Looks like a proper word in the photograph. Purbright reached for the photograph, a grainy image taken with the station's outdated camera. It showed indeed the vague contours of letters. They might have said Miles or Mill or perhaps Niles if one were generous with interpretation. He smiled faintly. "People see what the mind supplies, Sergeant, though it is odd that it should be that particular name." "Because he's been missing all them years?" "Because," said Purbright, leaning back, "coincidences tend to cluster like pigeons where someone's been feeding them." Love considered this, uncertain whether it was philosophy or instruction. Later that day, Purbright took his afternoon walk through the market square, a slow, measured route he had long cultivated as both exercise and intelligence gathering. The square was alive with its usual chorus, the butcher's laughter, the whine of a bicycle pump, and the gossip of 2 elderly ladies outside the chemist's. He caught fragments as he passed. He always looked the type to dabble in spiritualism, don't you think? "Well, the florist's lad, the new one, Kenneth, they say he's renting the very same room where Gedden kept his papers." Coincidence? Oh, my dear, not in this town. It was remarkable, Purbright thought, how swiftly the human mind constructed patterns from vapour. If there had been an outbreak of gout, the same names would likely have been invoked. At precisely 4 o'clock, Purbright stepped into the florist's shop. Kenneth Parry was arranging chrysanthemums with more seriousness than the task deserved. He was a tidy young man, perhaps 27, with a mild face and a nervous, apologetic manner. the sort that suggested long experience of mothers like Mrs. Parry. "Good afternoon," Purbright said pleasantly. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a word about the candles you supplied for the parish supper." Kenneth looked up, startled. "Oh, of course, sir. Is there something wrong with them?"
"Not wrong exactly," Purbright replied. "Merely memorable," the young man blinked. "You mean the thing everyone's talking about?" "I fear so," Kenneth flushed. "It's absurd, really. I made those candles myself, just plain molds, same as always."
"Beeswax and paraffin, nothing mystical. Do you recall which particular one went to Mrs. Harbottle's table?" Kenneth thought for a moment. "They were all boxed together.
"I don't think I marked them," Purbright nodded, his expression thoughtful but mild. "And you've heard the name it supposedly formed?"
"Yes, sir. Miles. It's a coincidence, that's all." He smiled weakly. "People in this town will make ghosts out of candle grease if it gives them something to talk about." Purbright smiled back. "Quite. Still, coincidence can be a rather talkative fellow, don't you find?" He left shortly afterward, pausing outside the shop to light a cigarette. Across the street, Mrs. Beasley was pretending to look at the window display of hats, while clearly listening to every word. By evening, the gossip had achieved full bloom. Mrs. Harbottle was now convinced the candle had been tampered with, though she could not decide whether by a mischievous youth or something beyond mortal explanation. Miss Larkin favoured the latter, of course, and told anyone who would listen that she had felt a presence that night, possibly the late Mr. Gedden himself, come to right some long ago wrong. In the snug of the feathers, Mr. Follett leaned over his pint and declared, "Mark my words, that candle weren't no accident. Them letters? It's guilt, that's what it is. Someone's conscience melting down for all to see." A remark which, as fate would have it, reached Purbright's ears by the following morning. He did not smile this time. He only looked down at his notes, where the single word Miles had been carefully written in his neat, almost prim handwriting. Beside it, a question mark. He tapped the end of his pencil against the page and murmured, half to himself, "Conscience. Yes, sometimes it flickers, but it rarely goes out." Flaxborough was never short of memory. Only agreement. Everyone recalled things, vividly, insistently, but rarely the same way twice. By Wednesday morning, the matter of the candle had matured like a ripe cheese, overhandled, richly scented and no longer resembling its original form. So it was that Inspector Purbright, mindful of the town's unique talent for recollection, began the slow, courteous process of asking questions. He started, inevitably, with Miss Lucilla Larkin. Miss Larkin lived in a narrow, overheated, semi-detached house on Gossamer Road, where the curtains were drawn halfway at all times. For modesty, as she told visitors, though the modesty appeared to have little to do with sunlight, she received Purbright with the mild fluster of one who had long dreamed of being questioned by the police, but never found the right opportunity. "Oh,
"Inspector," she said breathlessly, "I did wonder when you'd call."
Must be dreadful having to investigate something so spiritual." Purbright inclined his head. "It is a little outside the usual run of matters, yes. But I thought it best to hear from the lady who first observed the phenomenon." Miss Larkin straightened, both flattered and solemn.
"It was towards the end of the raffle, you see. Mrs. Harbottle was announcing the chutney winners, and I happened to look up, quite idly, really. And there it was. Letters, Inspector."
Glowing softly in the wax. "The name Miles, I could scarcely breathe." Purbright smiled faintly. "And you're quite certain it said Miles?"
"Oh yes, perfectly formed. Neat capitals."
"Not the sort of thing one could imagine." He nodded, taking a note.
"And you mentioned there was something unusual about the light."
Miss Larkin frowned delicately. A bluish hue, perhaps, though that could have been the fairy lights, or the tea urn. They do give off a glare. Indeed, a pause followed, during which Miss Larkin adjusted a porcelain figurine of a shepherdess, purely for moral support. "Tell me," Purbright said gently, Did you know Mr. Geddon well? Her hands hesitated on the shepherdess.
Oh, not well, Inspector.
He was a client of my father's once years ago. Something to do with property deeds.
A charming man, though there were rumours about him, of course. Rumours?
Well, you know how people talk. They said he
Entertained a widow rather too frequently.
and there was something about a missing file. But I shouldn't like to repeat idle gossip. You just have, Purbright said kindly. She coloured slightly but pressed on. Of course, I was quite a young woman at the time, barely 40, and one doesn't think of such matters. Still, I recall Mr. Geddon always wore gloves even indoors.
Odd, don't you think?
Perhaps he disliked fingerprints, Purbright murmured. She blinked. I beg your pardon? Just an observation, he said mildly, closing his notebook. You've been most helpful, Miss Larkin.
Oh, one final thing.
Did you by any chance notice who extinguished the candle that evening? The vicar, surely. He's very particular about naked flames. Ah, yes, thank you. He rose, thanked her again, and endured a parting gift of barley sugar before escaping into the relative sanity of the street. Back at the station, Sergeant Love was waiting with a file and a grin that suggested misplaced satisfaction. Got something, sir? The florist lad Parry, his tenancy at Geddon's old place, was arranged through the same solicitor's firm that used to employ Mr. Geddon. Purbright raised an eyebrow. A charming circularity. And what, if anything, does young Parry have to say about it? Claims he never even knew. Says the landlady told him it was a respectable address with a little history, which he took to mean damp walls. Purbright smiled. Flaxborough histories tend to be both shorter and wetter than that. Love nodded. Oh, there's more. Mrs. Beasley says she saw a light in that house 2 nights ago, after midnight. Thought it queer since Mr. Parry's away visiting his mother. Ah, Mrs. Beasley's midnight observations, Purbright said, half to himself. She could probably tell us who sins and when if we let her. Shall I check it, sir? Purbright considered. Yes, quietly, no need for alarm.
And, Sergeant, if you do go, take a proper torch. Mrs. Beasley's window view is known to improve with sherry. That afternoon, Purbright made a polite detour to the vicarage.
The Reverend Pottle, a thin, apologetic man who looked as though his cassock might blow away in a stiff breeze, met him in the hall. The candle inspector?
Oh, good heavens, yes. Extraordinary business.
My wife insists it's a sign. From whom? Well, she didn't specify. Simply a sign. She's a great believer in the unseen.
Unfortunately, she can't see a thing without her spectacles, which somewhat spoils the effect. Purbright allowed himself a brief smile.
You were the last to leave the hall that night, I believe.
Yes, indeed.
Blew out all the candles myself.
Terribly waxy business.
I remember that particular one because it sputtered a little, rather as if something damp were beneath the wick. I assumed condensation. Condensation rarely spells words, Purbright said gently. Pottle blinked. You mean you think it was deliberate? I think, said Purbright, that someone took advantage of the public's fondness for the peculiar. The vicar looked both relieved and disappointed. You mean a prank? Perhaps. Or perhaps a reminder. That evening, as twilight dulled the cobbles of the market square, Purbright sat at his desk with a cup of tepid tea and reviewed his notes. Miss Larkin's perfect recollection had already begun to crumble. Bluish lights that might have been fairy bulbs, a certainty of letters that blurred with each retelling. The vicar's candle had sputtered as if damp, an oddity, perhaps meaningless, but there was one thing that held his attention. Kenneth Parry, florist, living in the house once occupied by the missing Miles Geddon, a man too young to remember, too nervous to lie well, and yet somehow tethered to the same word that had melted in the church's candlelight. Purbright set down his pen and gazed at the brown paper parcel, still resting on the filing cabinet. Inside, the candle lay like a relic, hardened into silence. He spoke softly, to no one in particular. Memory plays tricks, but guilt. Guilt remembers exactly. By Friday morning, the mystery had acquired what every mystery in Flaxborough eventually does: a scapegoat. It began as such things tend to in the back room of the Feathers, where three of the town's most civic-minded men were enjoying a lunchtime pint and discussing moral decay. Mr. Follett, of the Council's Sanitation Committee, had it on unquestionable authority that the florist lad had been seen leaving the church after hours. Mr. Hargreaves, the churchwarden, recalled hearing a clink of metal near the vestry door that same night. By the time the third pint was poured, these recollections had merged seamlessly into certainty. Young Kenneth Parry had tampered with the candle, for reasons dark, unwholesome, and quite possibly romantic, and by the time they paid their bill, Mr. Hargreaves had decided to confess something. Inspector Purbright was not entirely surprised when the churchwarden appeared at the station that afternoon. Hargreaves was a large, pink-faced man with the moral conviction of someone who had never been caught doing anything truly wrong, though one felt, from his manner, that he regretted the lack of opportunity. He began with the air of a man about to reveal grave national secrets. "I've come." "Inspector," he said, removing his hat as though entering a confessional, to set the record straight.
"I can't abide whispering. That must make life in Flaxborough rather strenuous," Purbright observed mildly. Hargreaves ignored this. "I've been thinking about that candle. I believe I might have seen something improper." Purbright gestured him to a chair.
"Improper, Mr. Hargreaves, is a flexible word. Let's see if we can pin it down." The churchwarden cleared his throat. "Last Thursday evening I went into the vestry to fetch some hymn books, round 7, and there was that florist chap, Parry, standing near the altar rail with a box of candles. Looked as if he was swapping one for another. Did he see you?" "Oh, yes," seemed startled. Said Mrs. Harbottle had asked for extras. Claimed the first lot were too short for the holders. "And were they?" Hargreaves looked faintly puzzled.
"Couldn't say, really. I didn't measure them." Purbright made a note. "And you mentioned a noise near the vestry door?"
Hargreaves brightened. "Yes, the night of the supper. A metallic sort of sound, just after I'd locked up. Could have been the latch settling, or something dropped."
"Odd thing, though. Next morning, the side gate was unbolted. That would be the gate leading to the old churchyard?"
"Yes, Inspector. Where that solicitor fellow's family plot is, as it happens." Purbright looked up from his notebook. "Miles Gedden," Hargreaves nodded gravely, as though announcing a ghost by name. When Hargreaves had gone, satisfied that he had done his civic duty and exonerated himself from suspicion he'd never faced, Purbright sat for a moment in silence. Then he rang the bell for Sergeant Love. "Sergeant, our churchwarden has been seized by the patriotic urge to confess. It appears Mr. Parry may have swapped a candle at Mrs. Harbottle's table." Love's eyes widened.
"You mean—"
"I mean that our enterprising florist is either an eccentric prankster or a very unlucky young man." Love grinned.
"Could be both, sir," Purbright considered.
"Quite. Still, it would be a neat explanation." "Too neat, perhaps? Shall I bring him in?" "Not yet. Let's be sure of what we're accusing him of. It's poor form to interrogate a man over a decorative candle without at least one serious possibility in hand." That evening, Flaxborough was awash with talk. The churchwarden's visit, which he had solemnly promised to keep confidential, had already blossomed into a full-blown scandal by supper-time. Mrs. Harbottle, hearing that the florist had been seen meddling with holy objects, declared him either bewitched or criminal. Miss Larkin, not to be outdone, claimed she had always suspected something theatrical in his manner. Even Mrs. Parry, the young man's mother, appeared at the police station in tears, begging Inspector Purbright to tell people the truth. "Which truth, Mrs. Parry?" he asked gently. "That my Kenneth would never touch anything in a church without permission. He's nervous around altars, won't even arrange lilies too close in case they drip on the Bible, I see. He's a good boy, Inspector. Quiet, respectful."
"He wouldn't hurt a soul. It's not even a candle."
Purbright assured her that no arrest was intended. She left in a flurry of handkerchief and maternal righteousness. leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and guilt by association. Later, as twilight settled over the market square, Purbright walked alone to the church. The evening air was cool and faintly perfumed with damp stone and ivy. Inside, the nave was empty except for a thin line of light from the vestry. The vicar had gone home. Only the faint sound of dripping wax from the brass holders echoed in the quiet. Purbright examined the table where Mrs. Harbottle's centrepiece had been placed. There was a faint ring of wax, not much, but enough to show that a fresh candle had indeed been used that night. He traced it with his fingertip, frowning slightly. Then his eye caught something else. Near the brass stand, half hidden beneath a folded lace cloth, lay a small metal object, dull, round, and tarnished. He picked it up carefully, a matchbox of the old tin variety, the sort that usually bore a firm's name. This one was inscribed faintly, M. Gedden and Cumbers Solicitors. Purbright turned it over once, then twice. Inside was a single, short, wax match. He placed it carefully in his pocket, his expression unreadable. The next morning, Sergeant Love found him at his desk, staring at the matchbox as though it were a relic from a dream. "Odd thing that, sir," said Love, peering at it. "Would have thought those boxes would be long gone by now." "Quite," Purbright murmured.
And yet this one has surfaced, neatly beneath the very table where a candle spelled its owner's name. Love frowned. "You think someone planted it?"
"I think," said Purbright, "that someone wanted a story told, one that the town would willingly finish for them." Love scratched his head. "And who'd benefit from that?" Purbright smiled faintly. "That, Sergeant, is precisely the question I propose we ask next." He placed the matchbox back in its paper evidence envelope and leaned back in his chair. Outside, the bells of St. Botolph's began their slow, self-important chime. "Curious thing about candles," he said softly. "They burn for light, but they live for attention." The Saturday rain came with the peculiar punctuality of English weather, soft, resigned, and disinclined to leave. It turned the cobbles of Flaxborough's market square into slick grey mirrors, each reflecting a town that seemed almost to enjoy looking damp and miserable. Inside the police station, the day was proceeding with equal sluggishness. Sergeant Love was conducting what he optimistically called preliminary background inquiries, which largely involved telephoning the Gedden and Combe archives in Lincoln and waiting for clerks to look confused. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, was staring thoughtfully at the small tin matchbox resting on his blotter. It sat there like a punctuation mark in a conversation that no one else had noticed. "Strange, isn't it?" he said eventually. "How an object can vanish for decades and then reappear at precisely the moment when it ought not to." Love looked up from his notes. "You think it was planted, sir?" "Planted or misplaced, Sergeant. Both acts require intention. The question is whose." He leaned back, fingers steepled. "Miles Gedden disappears 17 years ago. His firm dissolves shortly after. The remaining partners, one retires, one dies, the rest scatter. Then, after all this time, his name reappears in melted wax, and a branded matchbox turns up under the parish table. It's all a little theatrical." Love gave a grin.
"So you think someone's staging it? Like a play?"
Purbright nodded slowly. "A play for an audience that enjoys gossip more than truth." By late morning, the post brought an envelope from Lincoln. Inside was a brief note from the records office confirming that Gedden and Co. had indeed ordered a batch of promotional matchboxes in 1947. The letter concluded, with bureaucratic tidiness, that none are known to remain in circulation. Purbright slipped it into his drawer. He had already decided that the matchbox had not been lying beneath the table for 17 years. The wax ring had been new, the cloth recently disturbed. Someone had been there quite recently to place it. But why? To revive an old scandal? To draw attention away from something else? He decided to ask a few more questions, quietly, without the official air of an inquiry. In Flaxborough, the truth travelled best when it wasn't being chased. His first call was to Mrs. Beasley, whose contribution to civic life consisted mainly of observing it. She welcomed him with the sort of smile reserved for both policemen and television repairmen, half respect, half hope of entertainment. "Oh, Inspector, you'll have heard, I suppose, about the light I saw in Mr. Parry's window last Tuesday?"
I have, Mrs. Beasley, Purbright said gently.
"You're quite certain it was his window?"
Oh, absolutely.
"The second floor, the left-hand side, the one with the peeling lace curtains. I could see it clear as day." "At midnight. Well, perhaps nearer to 11, she admitted. But the light was steady. Not gas, not candle, electric, and he was supposed to be away visiting his mother. Indeed.
And you saw no one enter or leave?
"No one at all, but—" Her eyes gleamed.
I did hear something odd earlier that evening. A van parked right outside. No markings.
"Stayed a good 20 minutes, Purbright nodded politely. "Made a note and promised to look into it." He did not add that Mrs. Beasley's idea of 20 minutes was notoriously flexible. Her kitchen clock had not kept proper time since the coronation. By midday, he was back in the market square, rain beading on his hat brim. He paused outside Parry's shop, watching the young man inside through the glass. Kenneth was arranging a display of lilies, white, tall, immaculate. His movements were steady, but there was a brittleness about them, as if each stem required careful emotional balance. When Purbright entered, Kenneth startled slightly. "Morning, Mr. Parry. Inspector?"
Oh, hello. Is this about the
candle again?" Among other things, Purbright looked around at the neat order of the shop. "You're fond of symmetry, I see," Kenneth smiled weakly. "My mother says it keeps the mind tidy." "An enviable state," Purbright murmured.
Tell me, do you keep candles here as well as flowers?
"Of course. For church use, mainly. We get them from a wholesaler in Grantham, but I pour some myself for special orders." "Like the ones you supplied to Mrs. Harbottle's supper?" "Yes, sir."
All identical. Well, almost. He hesitated and Purbright caught it instantly. Almost.
Kenneth sighed. One of them was slightly taller. I'd poured it too full and didn't have time to trim it properly.
I thought it'd burn longer, that's all. Purbright regarded him quietly. And that particular one, you're certain it went to the church hall?
Kenneth frowned.
It must have.
I packed all 8 together.
Unless?
Well, there was one I left drying overnight on the bench. It had a hairline crack in the wax near the base. I noticed it next morning, but it was gone from the tray. Thought I'd misplaced it. Purbright's expression didn't change.
And that would have been around the time Mrs. Harbottle collected them?
"Yes, sir. Thursday morning, I see," he thanked the young man, bought a small bunch of chrysanthemums for propriety's sake, and left. Back at the station, Purbright unwrapped the flowers slowly, as though each petal might contain an idea. He turned to Love, a candle with a crack, missing from the florist's bench, a matchbox belonging to a vanished solicitor found beneath that very candle's table.
And a young man who insists he didn't put it there. Love looked up from his desk. You think someone else switched the candles? Possibly.
Or returned the missing one after using it elsewhere. Love frowned.
Elsewhere, sir?
Purbright smiled. In Flaxborough, Sergeant, elsewhere covers a multitude of sins. He stood, went to the window and looked out at the square. The rain had slowed, leaving the cobblestones slick and gleaming. Across the street, Mrs. Beasley was confiding something to a constable with the gravity of a witness to history. "Do me a favour, love," he said quietly. "Go over to the churchyard and take a look at Mr. Geddon's family plot. See if anything looks disturbed." Love blinked. "Disturbed, sir?"
Not dramatically.
"Flaxborough doesn't do drama. Just tidied, perhaps." An hour later, the sergeant returned, boots muddy and expression uneasy. "Well, sir," he began, "I think you'd best see for yourself." Purbright followed him out to the churchyard. The graves lay in their usual polite disarray, weathered stones leaning like old men in conversation. They stopped at the Geddon plot. The headstone was unremarkable, the name barely legible. But what drew the eye was the patch of fresh soil before it, neat, deliberate, recently turned. Purbright crouched, touched the earth with his gloved hand, and found it cold but loose. "Someone's been gardening," Love offered. Purbright's tone was almost conversational. "Yes, and I rather think they've been planting something other than flowers." He straightened.
Brushing soil from his gloves. "Sergeant," he said softly.
"I suspect our candle wasn't the only thing that's been remembering Mr. Geddon." The following afternoon brought one of those half-tone English Sundays that never quite commit to weather. The clouds loitered without conviction, the church bells sounded faintly apologetic, and the whole town seemed to be waiting politely for something to happen. Inspector Purbright, as ever obliged by doing nothing obvious, he had, through experience, found that the surest way to make a Flaxborough secret reveal itself was to sit down with the person least likely to keep it, which is why at precisely 3 o'clock he was taking tea with Mrs. Beasley. Mrs. Beasley's sitting room had the faint aroma of boiled cabbage and duty. Every surface bore a crochet mat, and every mat bore an object too fragile to touch. She poured tea in the manner of one conducting a sacred ritual, her eyes never leaving the inspector's face. "I can't tell you how relieved I am, Inspector," she began, "that you've taken this matter in hand."
"I always said the truth would come out." "Indeed," Purbright said mildly.
"The trouble, Mrs. Beasley, is that it generally comes out wearing someone else's hat." She gave a fluttering laugh.
"Oh, you are droll, Inspector."
"But I assure you I only repeat what I see. That must be a full-time occupation in Flaxborough." She smiled modestly. "One likes to stay observant," Purbright nodded. "Quite. Now, you mentioned a van outside Mr. Parry's house the night before the supper." "Yes, Inspector. Parked just beyond the postbox."
"No markings, but I distinctly recall hearing it."
"A low hum. Diesel, I should say. It left after 20 minutes. Did you happen to notice anyone near it?" She frowned, tapping her teaspoon against the cup. "No one distinct."
"Though, yes."
There was a light in the window above.
"A figure, perhaps?"
"Could have been Mr. Parry, but then he was supposed to be away." Purbright inclined his head. "And you're sure it wasn't his mother?" "Oh, no, Mrs. Parry lives across town near the park. Terrible rheumatism."
"Hardly moves after dark. So it was someone else in the house?" "Unless," she said, eyes widening, "it was him." Purbright waited. "Mr. Geddon," she whispered, "back to finish whatever business he left undone."
Purbright smiled faintly. A remarkable feat of endurance for a man 17 years absent. Mrs. Beasley sighed, disappointed. "You don't believe in signs, then?" "I believe," Purbright said gently, "that signs are often hung by people who prefer not to be seen doing so." When he left her house an hour later, laden with unsolicited fruitcake, Purbright walked slowly through the quiet streets. The rain had begun again, a thin drizzle that blurred reflections and made the town look faintly ashamed of itself. His thoughts, however, were clear. The van, the unbolted gate, the disturbed soil, each pointed to someone using Geddon's memory as stage decoration. But the purpose still eluded him. He stopped outside the florist's. The shutters were down. A closed-for-stock-taking sign hung in the window. "A cautious lie if ever he saw one. Stock-taking," said Sergeant Love later that evening, when informed. "Odd time for it, sir. Sunday, indeed."
"Perhaps the stock is taking itself." Purbright handed him the matchbox.
"Have this dusted, would you? And compare the prints against those we took from young Parry when he signed the witness form. Quietly." "Right you are, sir." Purbright turned to the window. The street lamps outside flickered in the mist. "And, Sergeant, ask the garage on High Street if they've filled any unmarked vans this past week. Preferably those paid in cash." Love nodded and departed, leaving the inspector alone with his thoughts and, faintly, the sound of the church bell tolling 7. The next morning brought new visitors. Mrs. Harbottle swept into the station.
Her expression that of a woman burdened by civic responsibility and personal vindication. "I've come," she announced.
To make a statement, Purbright regarded her with polite dread.
"Of course.
About the candle?
About morality, Inspector. And the young man who's been mocking it. Mr. Parry." She sat, uninvited, and leaned forward.
You must know, Inspector, that Kenneth Parry has been keeping company with Miss Larkin. She told me so herself. Well, she implied it. And I cannot help but feel that these manifestations may have something to do with their friendship. Purbright suppressed a sigh. In what way, precisely? Romantic impropriety, naturally. Miss Larkin's been fanciful since her youth.
"And a widow's heart," she added, though Miss Larkin had never been married, "is a fragile thing." Purbright closed his notebook. "Thank you, Mrs. Harbottle. I shall bear her widowhood in mind," she hesitated. "You don't think I'm being uncharitable?"
Never, Mrs. Harbottle, merely thorough. When she'd gone, Sergeant Love returned with his findings. Matchbox prints came back, sir.
"One clear thumb mark."
Doesn't match Parry's, not even close. Purbright's brow lifted.
"No, no, sir."
Smaller hand? Possibly a woman's, the inspector smiled faintly. Ah, now the stage hands are multiplying. Love handed him a slip of paper.
"Also checked the garage."
2 nights before the supper, a van filled up. Grey Bedford, cash paid. Registered to a Mrs. M. Larkin. Purbright sat very still. Well, well, he said softly. Miss Lucilla does remember differently after all. That evening the inspector took another quiet walk to the churchyard. The air was sharp with rain, the lamps glowing like small, uncertain souls. He stood before the Gedon plot again. The fresh earth looked slightly darker now, pressed down by Sunday shoes and curiosity. He knelt, brushing aside the surface with a gloved hand. Something glimmered faintly in the soil. Not bone, not stone, something metallic. He eased it free, a small silver button, ornate, feminine. He turned it over in his palm. The back bore a faint trace of thread, pale blue. Purbright smiled, a sort of smile that was both kind and quietly certain. "Sergeant Love," he said the next morning, "find out what colour dress Miss Larkin wore to the parish supper." Love blinked. "Why, sir?" "Because," Purbright said, "I believe our ghost has been remarkably well dressed. On Monday night," Flaxborough dreamed uneasily, "the rain had cleared, leaving the air heavy with that peculiar freshness that only comes after guilt or weather. The streets gleamed, the gutters whispered, and behind the neat curtains of respectable homes, the town's imagination got properly to work. By morning, there was a new story to discuss. The first to hear it was Mrs. Beasley, naturally.
At 10:30 she burst into the bakery with the excitement of one delivering scripture. "They say the light came back,"
she announced, almost toppling a tray of Chelsea buns. "The light?"
asked the baker, already regretting it. "In Mr. Perry's window."
"The same one I told the inspector about. Bright as anything, like a lantern. Mrs. Harbottle saw it herself this time, and she's not one to exaggerate." A small cough from the woman behind her suggested mild dissent, but Mrs. Beasley continued undeterred. 2 o'clock in the morning, it was, and not just light, movement.
A shadow walking across the curtains. Tall, thin.
Ghostly, you might say. Could have been a cat, someone offered. Not unless cats take to pacing upright, Mrs. Beasley snapped. No, my dear, this is something else. By noon, half of Flaxborough was convinced that Miles Gedden, or his spectre, had returned to claim whatever had been hidden all those years ago. By 2, the other half was sure the florist had finally gone mad. By 3, Inspector Purbright had stopped both halves from forming a committee. When Sergeant Love reported the incident, Purbright listened without interrupting. So, Love concluded, Mrs. Harbottle swears she saw light behind the curtain of Parry's flat at 2 a.m., and when she went to fetch her husband, it had gone. Purbright leaned back. Did she specify which curtain? The left-hand one. Same as Mrs. Beasley's sighting last week. Love scratched his head. Could be somebody broke in, sir. Or maybe Parry came back early and didn't want folk to know. Possible.
Or perhaps someone wanted to seem like Parry, Love frowned.
You think someone's setting him up? Purbright smiled faintly. I think, Sergeant, that in Flaxborough, reputation is a currency more easily stolen than money. By evening, the inspector decided to see the flat himself. It was located above the florist's, a narrow stairway leading to a door painted the colour of defeat. The landlady, Mrs. Trigg, met him at the foot of the stairs, an elderly woman with an expression carved permanently between suspicion and apology. I haven't let anyone in, Inspector, not since young Parry left. Said he'd be back Tuesday. But there's been noises. Light too last night.
I thought I'd imagined it, Purbright smiled reassuringly.
People rarely imagine what they most wish were untrue. She handed him a heavy ring of keys. Do take care, sir. The floorboards creak like confessions. Upstairs, the air smelled faintly of dust and roses. The small sitting room was tidy, except for one oddity. On the table stood a half-burnt candle in a saucer. Not the type one bought at a shop. Hand-poured, beeswax, faintly uneven. Purbright bent closer.
Its wick had burned down to a crater, forming, quite unmistakably, the faint outline of a single letter. M. He said nothing for several minutes.
Then he opened the curtains slightly. The glass was clean, but the latch showed a faint smudge, a small handprint, slender fingers. He made a note, then descended quietly. At the station, Sergeant Love was waiting with news. That button you found, sir, came from a dress made by Marsh's haberdashery. Miss Larkin bought one just like it 3 years ago for the parish fete. Purbright nodded. Colour? Blue, sir. He placed the half-burnt candle on the desk. I found this in Parry's flat. Hand-poured, same make as the others. And unless my eyes deceive me, someone's been continuing the alphabet. Love blinked. You mean the wax letters? Yes, first Miles. Now someone's reminding us of the name piece by piece. Though I confess, I'm curious why our ghost can't spell it all at once. Love gave a cautious smile.
Maybe it's shy. Purbright allowed himself a small laugh.
Or methodical. He turned the candle between his fingers. The question, Sergeant, is who benefits from reminding Flaxborough of Mr. Gedden and from making young Parry appear haunted by him? That evening, Purbright took an unhurried stroll down Market Street. The lamps flickered and shop windows stared blankly into the dark. He paused at the florist's once more. Behind the shutters, faint traces of light moved, perhaps reflection, perhaps memory. Miss Larkin appeared, quite by accident, or so she claimed. "Oh, Inspector," she said, startled.
How strange to see you here. I was just passing. 8:30.
She smiled nervously.
Couldn't sleep.
Thought a walk might settle me. Purbright's gaze shifted to the small parcel in her hands. Something from the shop?
Oh, just flowers.
For the church? Of course. He didn't stop her as she hurried away, but he noticed the faint glimmer of wax at the edge of the brown paper. The next morning, Purbright arrived at St. Botolph's before anyone else. The church was cold, echoing, and faintly perfumed with yesterday's incense. On the altar, among the usual arrangement of lilies and candles, one new item stood out. A single beeswax candle, unlit, immaculate, taller than the rest. He touched its surface gently. Near the base, half-formed in the wax, was another letter, I, Purbright sighed, the kind of sigh that precedes understanding. "Sergeant," he said later that day, "I think our culprit enjoys serialization."
And then I...
"And since Miss Larkin is so fond of drama, I suspect she'll provide us with the next installment soon." "You think she's behind it, sir?" "I think she's behind a curtain she's forgotten isn't soundproof." That night, a quiet figure moved through the churchyard, carrying a small box and a candle. The moon watched, pale and complicit. In the shadow of the Gedden plot, a faint scratching sound disturbed the soil. The figure set something down, then paused as a voice, calm and polite, spoke from the darkness. "Good evening, Miss Larkin." The candle fell. Purbright stepped forward, hands in his coat pockets. "I was hoping you'd continue the story. We've had M and I already. Perhaps tonight you meant to give us L?" Her face, pale in the moonlight, seemed to collapse inwards. "You don't understand," she whispered. "It wasn't meant to hurt anyone."
"I only wanted him remembered. Miles Gedden."
She nodded, trembling. "He was kind to me once, before he vanished."
"I thought if people spoke his name again, it might—"
"Bring him peace, or bring you attention," Purbright said gently. "In Flaxborough, they're much the same thing." He led her quietly back toward the gate, where Sergeant Love waited. Behind them, the candle guttered out in the wet grass, the name of the dead once again incomplete. Purbright turned for one last look at the grave. "Strange thing, Sergeant," he murmured. "Most people forget the dead too quickly. But in this town they sometimes have to be reminded to stop remembering. There was," Inspector Purbright reflected, "an art to remembering, and an even subtler one to forgetting." Flaxborough, to its credit, excelled at both. Tuesday morning, the arrest of Miss Lucilla Larkin had been received by the town with the sort of moral excitement usually reserved for visiting choirs and mild scandal. To most, her guilt was self-evident, her motives suitably romantic, and her punishment, whatever it turned out to be, a reassurance that the world still ran on familiar lines. But Purbright, who had learned that familiarity was often a disguise, found the whole affair curiously unsatisfying. He sat alone in his office that morning, the blinds half drawn against the anemic sunlight, his desk neatly divided between paperwork and doubt. Before him lay the half-burnt candles, the tarnished matchbox,
and the small silver button found in the Gedden grave. Miss Larkin had confessed, yes, or rather,
explained, that she had planted the matchbox beneath Mrs. Harbottle's table and poured the candles herself. Her intention, she said, was to rekindle remembrance. The language of theatre, not crime, and yet there were inconsistencies. The first, that she could not have placed the matchbox under the parish table on the night in question. Mrs. Harbottle had arrived early and set her decorations long before Miss Larkin came to the hall. The second, that the button found near the grave did not match any garment Miss Larkin owned. Her blue dress, though similar, used plain fastenings. No, Purbright thought Miss Larkin had played a part, but not the whole performance. Sergeant Love entered, carrying 2 cups of tea, and the expression of a man who had heard far too much gossip before breakfast. "They're all talking, sir." Poor Miss Larkin. "Some say she was in love with that Gedden fellow. Others say she's been writing to him for years." "Letters to the dead are safer than to the living," Purbright said absently. Love nodded. "Still can't help feeling sorry for her. She's not dangerous, just lonely." "Loneliness," Purbright replied, "is one of the more industrious motives in this town. It gets up early and stays late." He took the tea, sipped thoughtfully. "Tell me, Sergeant, what do we know of Mr. Gedden's disappearance beyond the folklore?" Love consulted his notes. "Vanished in November 48, left his office one evening, told his clerk he was closing an account before heading home. Never seen again.
No body, no trace.
His wife went to live with a sister in Whitby. House stood empty until recently when young Parry took it." Purbright nodded slowly.
And the records?
"Most were destroyed in a fire the year after. They said electrical fault. Funny thing, the insurance paid out fast. Flaxborough does not encourage prolonged mysteries. It tidies them into accidents." He rose, went to the window, and looked out upon the square, genteel, spotless, and deceitfully tranquil. People drifted by as they always did, carrying small errands and smaller truths. "I wonder, Sergeant," he said at length, "how much of Miss Larkin's play-acting was her own idea?" Love frowned. You mean someone put her up to it? Perhaps not directly, but suggestion is a powerful form of authorship. Suppose someone fed her just enough of the old Geddon story to inspire her little haunting. Someone who knew it'd point to Perry, or to anyone convenient. Love hesitated.
But who'd do that?
Purbright smiled faintly. Someone who knows how Flaxborough thinks. That afternoon, he paid a quiet visit to Kenneth Parry's lodgings. The young man had returned from his mother's, pale and drawn, and was now sweeping the shop floor with unnecessary vigour. "I hear Miss Larkin's been taken into custody," he said, before Purbright spoke. "I suppose everyone thinks she's mad." "Not mad," Purbright said gently. "Just misdirected." Kenneth sighed. "She came here, you know."
Night before the supper.
Said she wanted to buy candles for remembrance. She looked strange.
Like she was half in love and half in a trance. And you sold them to her?
"Yes, sir. Even helped her pack them. Thought it harmless." "Did she mention Miles Geddon?" He hesitated. "Only that she used to know him. Said he'd done her a kindness once." "She wouldn't say what." Purbright nodded. "And your landlord, Mrs. Trigg, she's been here long?" "All her life, I think. Her husband died years ago."
Funny thing, she told me once she used to clean for Mr. Geddon. Said he was a stickler for dust. Purbright's eyes narrowed a fraction.
"Indeed." He bought another small bouquet, thanked the young man, and left. Back at the station, the pieces began to arrange themselves with the quiet logic of dust settling. Miss Larkin's performance, sentimental, misguided but not malevolent, had been prompted by someone who knew both her romantic weakness and the old scandal. Someone who'd want to distract attention from a more recent trespass. And Mrs. Trigg, the landlady, had been quietly in place through all of it. Guardian of an old house and an older secret. He took up the silver button again. The thread still clung faintly to its back. Blue, yes, but also thick as from upholstery, not dressmaking, a cushion perhaps, or a sofa. At 6:30, Purbright and Sergeant Love visited the Geddon house. Mrs. Trigg met them at the door, hands folded in a towel, face composed but wary. "Evening, Inspector. I hope you're not here about that nonsense in the papers." "Only about the past, Mrs. Trigg," Purbright said kindly. "Though I imagine you tidy that as well as the rest." She looked puzzled. "Beg pardon? Would you mind if we stepped in for a moment?" Reluctantly, she opened the door. The hallway smelled faintly of wax and polish. Inside, everything was immaculate, the sort of tidiness that speaks of fear rather than order. "Lovely sofa," Love remarked, almost idly. "Old, isn't it?" "Mr. Geddon's," she said shortly. "Left it when he went." Purbright ran his hand along the armrest. The stitching was newer than the fabric. One button was missing. "Odd," he murmured, "how some things outlast their owners." Mrs. Trigg swallowed.
"You've no right." "No, but I have reason," Purbright interrupted softly.
The soil at the Geddon grave was disturbed recently. Something was moved or perhaps taken back.
"I imagine, Mrs. Trigg, that whatever happened to Mr. Geddon 17 years ago didn't happen in the churchyard." Her silence was long and brittle.
"Then?" "He was cruel." Purbright said nothing. "He said he'd ruined my husband's name. Laughed about it."
"I only meant to frighten him."
"But he fell, hit his head."
"I buried him under the floor in the old pantry."
"When they pulled the house down 10 years ago, I moved what was left, for decency's sake, into the family plot, where he belongs." She looked at Purbright with a defiant calm that was almost relief. "And if that's a sin, Inspector, I'll answer for it." Purbright regarded her quietly. "I believe you just have." Later, in his office, he wrote his report with careful understatement. Accidental death subsequently concealed. Motive: fear of exposure, sustained by conscience. He closed the file and looked out at the rain-soaked town. "Memory," he murmured, "is never about what we remember."
"Only about what we choose not to." The next morning dawned with a clarity so precise it felt almost accusatory.
The rain had scrubbed the air clean, leaving the rooftops shining like conscience after confession. Flaxborough, in its modest way, was refreshed, though not yet redeemed. Inspector Purbright, who preferred mornings to be hazy enough for thought, found the sunshine slightly indecent. It gave too much away. He stood by the window of his office, hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at Market Street. Neat, familiar, deceitful. Sergeant Love, who had perfected the art of reading his superior's silences, waited until the inspector spoke. "Do you know, Sergeant?" Purbright said at last. "There's something almost admirable about Flaxborough's ability to tidy sin into sentiment." Love frowned. "Meaning Miss Larkin, sir?" "In part. She'll be forgiven before she's even charged. A few sympathetic teas, a parish collection, and by next month she'll be chairing the floral committee again." Love smiled faintly.
"And Mrs. Trigg?" "Ah," Purbright said, turning.
"Mrs. Trigg won't be forgiven quite so readily. There's a difference between gossip and guilt. One refreshes the town, the other unsettles it." He reached for his hat. "Come, Sergeant, we're due a courtesy visit." Mrs. Trigg's house, formerly Mr. Gedden's, looked precisely as it had the evening before. Curtains drawn to an exact symmetry, brass letterbox polished to piety. She opened the door before Purbright could knock. "Inspector," she said flatly, "I thought we'd said everything that needed saying." "Almost," Purbright replied, stepping past her into the hallway. "But there's a final detail or two."
"And I do hate to leave things untidy." Her lips tightened.
"If it's about that business in the churchyard, I told you how it happened. There's nothing more to tell, indeed, except perhaps who moved him the second time." Her eyes flickered. "The soil, Mrs. Trigg," Purbright continued, his tone, courteous but implacable, "was disturbed twice. The first when you buried him, the second quite recently, perhaps a week ago."
"I imagine you went there yourself. Or sent someone." "I didn't,"
she said sharply, then caught herself. Purbright's voice was almost kind.
"No, I think Miss Larkin did."
"You told her something, didn't you? Something about a man's body that deserved remembrance." Her hands trembled slightly. She asked questions, about Mr. Gedden, about the house.
"I only said he was cruel, that he'd ruined lives. I didn't tell her that you killed him."
The colour drained from her face. "You have no proof." "None I care to use," Purbright said quietly. "You've lived with the truth long enough to be punished by it. I've no wish to improve on nature." He looked around the sitting room, his gaze resting briefly on the armchair where the upholstery sagged slightly. The exact shape of an old secret. "What I would like to know," he said,
"is why, after all these years, you let that poor woman dig up the past for you." Mrs. Trigg's composure wavered.
"Because she was the only one who believed me. The others, they thought I was lying or mad. I wanted someone to see I wasn't." "So you gave her the matchbox," Purbright said softly. "Told her a story of betrayal, and she made it into a ghost tale. She thought it would make people remember him kindly," Mrs. Trigg whispered. "But I knew they wouldn't. I wanted them to remember what he was." Purbright's expression didn't change, but his eyes held a quiet sadness. "Flaxborough remembers what it finds convenient."
Mrs. Trigg, never what's true. He left her sitting by the window,
staring out into the square, as if waiting for someone who had missed 17 years' worth of appointments. Outside, Sergeant Love looked at him questioningly. "Will she be charged, sir?" Purbright shook his head. "No, there's little point. What began as a crime ended as a confession. She served her sentence in silence." Love exhaled slowly.
"And Miss Larkin?"
"Let her go. Her ghosts are all imaginary, which makes them safer than most." That afternoon, Purbright made one last call, hummed to the Reverend Pottle at St. Botolph's. The vicar received him with the enthusiasm of a man who rarely received visitors, not selling things. "My dear Inspector, I can't tell you what a relief it is that this ghastly business is over. Poor Miss Larkin and that dreadful woman, Mrs. Trigg. Of course, we all suspected she wasn't quite sound." Purbright smiled faintly. You suspected everyone eventually, Reverend. It's one of your more democratic virtues, Pottle flushed. Well, I'm sure the Lord will sort it all out. I'm sure he will, said Purbright. Though between ourselves I think he's had some help. He looked around the vestry, newly polished, innocent of wax drips or secrets. You'll be holding service this Sunday, I imagine? Indeed. Harvest Festival. Then might I suggest, Reverend, that this year you omit the candles altogether? Pottle blinked. Oh, why? Purbright adjusted his hat. Because, Reverend, some names once remembered refused to stay at rest. That evening, Flaxborough glowed once more with its familiar, wholesome deceit. The church bells rang as they always did, the shops closed punctually, and the townsfolk congratulated themselves on having survived yet another moral adventure. Mrs. Harbottle resumed her committee meetings. Miss Larkin, released with a caution and much sympathy, took to visiting the churchyard at dusk, placing flowers and whispering apologies to no one in particular. Mrs. Trigg stayed indoors, and Inspector Purbright returned to his paperwork. That endless, civilized burial ground of consequence. He wrote his final note in the case file with small, neat precision. Flaxborough remains as it was, orderly, scandalous, and serenely self-deceived, a town that polishes its brass while the silver tarnishes beneath. He closed the folder, placed it on the shelf, and poured himself a modest measure of sherry. As he raised it to his lips, Sergeant Love appeared at the door. "Everything all right, sir?" "Perfectly," said Purbright. "Just tidying memory." "Memory, sir?" Purbright smiled, the expression gentle, almost wistful. "Yes, Sergeant. It's the most persistent form of untidiness there is." The next evening, the parish room was fuller than it had been since the Queen's Silver Jubilee. Word had spread by routes faster than the telephone exchange that Inspector Purbright was going to explain everything. No one knew precisely who had asked him to. Possibly the vicar, possibly Mrs. Harbottle, possibly the collective conscience of Flaxborough itself, which never felt comfortable until sin had been catalogued and cross-referenced. The long oak tables were laid with tea things and tension. Mrs. Beasley
had brought scones in case it ran emotion. Miss Larkin, pale but composed,
sat near the door with the poise of a woman who had recently discovered she was not a criminal, but only foolish. The vicar fidgeted beside his wife, and Sergeant Love loomed dutifully in the background like a moral bookend. Purbright entered quietly, removed his hat, and surveyed the assembly with his usual air of benevolent fatigue. "My dear friends," he began, "I understand you'd like a little clarity about recent events concerning the candle, the matchbox,
and the unfortunate matter of Mr. Miles Gedden." A ripple of self-righteous cough spread through the hall.
He continued unhurried. "First, let me say that Flaxborough remains a most admirable town. Its people are observant, helpful, and not above speculation when civic duty demands it." Mrs. Harbottle flushed, uncertain whether this was praise. "Now," Purbright went on, "the candle that bore Mr. Gedden's name was not the work of supernatural forces, nor of divine intervention, nor of any vengeful ghost. It was the work of a very human longing, Miss Larkin's to be precise." All heads turned. Miss Larkin straightened, chin lifted. "She poured those candles herself," Purbright said, believing she was honouring a man she once admired. "She placed the matchbox beneath the parish table to attract notice, a small theatrical gesture. Unfortunately, she was not alone in her interest." He paused, letting the silence breathe. "The matchbox she used came from another source, Mrs. Trigg, the housekeeper in Mr. Gedden's former residence. Mrs. Trigg, as some of you know, was acquainted with Mr. Gedden in less than happy circumstances. She concealed the fact that she caused his death, accidentally, during a quarrel, and later reburied his remains in the churchyard." A soft gasp went around the hall. Even Mrs. Harbottle, who claimed to be beyond surprise, made a small involuntary noise like a tea kettle resigned to its fate. Mrs. Trigg, Purbright continued evenly, never confessed because she believed she had done the righteous thing. But conscience, like mildew, spreads quietly. When she saw Miss Larkin's fascination with the past, she encouraged it, gave her relics, told her half-truths, and allowed her to think she was reviving a ghost. In doing so, she revived the truth. He allowed the room to absorb this. Even Sergeant Love shifted uncomfortably. The idea that two such mild women could stir so much trouble seemed to offend his sense of domestic peace. Purbright resumed, his tone gentler now. The rest, the lights, the grave, the so-called haunting, was embroidery, stitched by our good townsfolk. You saw what you hoped to see and heard what you wished someone would finally admit. Mrs. Beasley coloured faintly, remembering her testimony about shadows pacing upright. Mr. Parry, Purbright went on, turning toward the bewildered florist, was merely the unlucky custodian of a house with too many memories. His only crime was an unwise choice of lodging and an excess of beeswax. Kenneth nodded gratefully, his relief visible enough to draw sympathetic sighs from several ladies who had previously assumed his guilt. The vicar, attempting a tone of spiritual conclusion, said, "So justice has been served, then?" Purbright gave him a small, dry smile. "Justice, Reverend, is a word I prefer not to use too quickly. It suggests something tidy." He folded his hands behind his back. "Miss Trigg has agreed to make a formal statement. Miss Larkin's part in this is concluded. As for the rest of us, I suggest we return to our previous pursuits, some to gardening, some to rumour, and a few to quiet reflection." He inclined his head slightly as though ending a sermon of his own. Flaxborough may now, if it wishes, rest. But the town, being Flaxborough, did not rest immediately. There followed several minutes of whispered commentaries, moral evaluations, and logistical concerns about what would happen to Mrs. Trigg's house. Mrs. Harbottle proposed a charitable subcommittee. The vicar suggested a moment of silent prayer. Mrs. Beasley suggested another scone. Through it all, Purbright stood serenely, watching the current of gossip turn the raw material of truth into something pleasantly conversational. Only Miss Larkin approached him afterward. She looked smaller now, as if some inner scaffolding had been dismantled. "Inspector," she said softly, "I truly meant no harm. I thought, if people spoke his name kindly again, he might forgive me for forgetting him." Purbright regarded her with a calm, paternal sympathy. "People don't forgive being forgotten, Miss Larkin.
They forgive being remembered badly." She gave a small, watery smile.
Will they forget me too?"
"In time," he said.
"That's the only mercy we all receive." When the parish hall finally emptied, Purbright lingered. The leftover candles flickered faintly in the draught, their light soft and unremarkable. Sergeant Love came to stand beside him. "You did well, sir."
"Calm them all down? I doubt it," Purbright replied.
"They'll be discussing this for months."
"By Christmas, Mr. Gedden will have been murdered twice more and resurrected once." Love chuckled.
"You think so little of human nature, sir?" "On the contrary," Purbright said, smiling faintly. "I think exactly enough." He looked at the table where the first candle had burned.
"Funny thing, Sergeant.
In the end, there was no mystery at all, only people trying to remember the past without admitting their part in it." Love nodded. "So that's it then?" "Almost," Purbright said, putting on his hat. "We've the paperwork to prove it happened, and the gossip to prove it didn't. Between the two, posterity will manage nicely." They walked out together into the cooling evening. The street lamps had come on, and for a moment the golden light caught on the wet cobbles, shimmering like candle wax. Purbright glanced up at the church tower and murmured, "The dead, Sergeant, are rarely as quiet as we pretend. By the time October folded into itself and the mornings began with mist instead of gossip, Flaxborough had done what it did best. It had forgotten. Not completely, of course. No English town forgets completely. It files things away in conversational drawers to be reopened when the right visitor, weather, or brand of sherry calls for them. But the incident of the candle that remembered his name had already begun its descent from scandal to anecdote. At the bakery, Mrs. Beasley told the story with generous revisions. Of course, I always said it wasn't the boy. Poor lamb, nervous as a sparrow. You could see it in his carnations. At the hairdresser's, Mrs. Harbottle gave it an air of moral instruction. Shows what happens when unmarried women dabble in wax. And at the Feathers, Mr. Follett was already claiming to have suspected that housekeeper woman from the very start, though his earlier remarks, recorded in Sergeant Love's notes, had blamed it on witchcraft or foreigners. Flaxborough, as Inspector Purbright had once observed, had no need of history. It simply repeated its morals. In the police station, the office clock ticked with bureaucratic serenity. The report on the Gedden affair, labelled Routine Inquiry, Unlawful Burial, No Prosecution, had already been sent to the county authorities, where it would no doubt moulder among the polite tragedies of the district. Sergeant Love stood by the filing cabinet, holding a newspaper. "They've printed it, sir," he said, as though the headline were a small miracle. Purbright glanced up.
"Ah, what are we this week? Heroes or nuisances?" Love read aloud.
Local police close-range candle case. Inspector. Praised for calm approach. Community urged to look forward. Purbright smiled faintly.
"Excellent advice, though one rarely taken." Love folded the paper carefully.
Funny business, though. Makes you think, doesn't it? All that fuss, and in the end just one mistake 17 years old. Just? Purbright said mildly. I wouldn't call 17 years of concealment just a mistake, Sergeant. But I take your point. Time, like dust, covers a multitude of things, mostly inconvenient. Love nodded. Still, good to see it all settled. Purbright regarded him with a look half amused, half sad. Oh, I don't think it's settled, love. Not really. Mrs. Trigg will live on in whispers. Miss Larkin will be pitied into local sainthood. And by Advent, someone else will have misplaced their virtue or their husband. The machinery of decency is wonderfully perpetual. That afternoon, he walked through the town as he often did when a case concluded. There was a comfort in observing the persistence of ordinary life. The butcher sweeping his step, the postmistress adjusting her spectacles to glare at nobody in particular, the slow trudge of children in damp uniforms. He paused by the florist's. Kenneth Parry, restored to tranquillity, was arranging chrysanthemums in the window. White, neat, faintly melancholy. The young man looked up, saw the inspector, and smiled. "All quiet again, sir?" he said. "For the moment," Purbright replied. "Flaxborough has an uncommon talent for recovering from revelations." "I'm glad it's over," said Kenneth.
"I keep thinking about that poor woman, Mrs. Trigg. She must have been frightened all her life." Purbright nodded.
"Fright, Mr. Parry, is the most English emotion there is. We just call it respectability." By evening, mist had crept back along the river. From his office window, Purbright watched it roll gently through the square, turning lamps into soft coins of light. On his desk, the case file sat closed, tidy, complete, unnecessary. He reached for his pen, then paused, listening. Somewhere in the corridor, Sergeant Love was humming tunelessly, contentedly. Purbright smiled. The sound was oddly reassuring. He looked at the candle stub still resting on his shelf, a small, ordinary thing that had once set the whole town whispering. He struck a match, lit it, and let the tiny flame burn steadily in the dimness. It gave off no message this time, no miracle, just light enough to see the dust motes dance, he thought, not without fondness, that perhaps that was the true miracle, that life, however foolish, kept burning quietly on. The church bells began their evening chime. Somewhere, Mrs. Harbottle was almost certainly arranging a meeting to discuss the moral tone of next month's Christmas bazaar. Mrs. Beasley would attend, of course, with scones and information. Miss Larkin would sit near the door, half listening, half remembering, not quite forgiven and not quite condemned, and Inspector Purbright would remain in his office, writing in his precise, looping hand a final note in his private journal, the only document never meant for filing. Flaxborough continues in good order. Its sins remain small, its consciences smaller. The living still mistake curiosity for virtue, and the dead are politely silent. God preserve us all, though I sometimes suspect he prefers to watch. He closed the notebook, snuffed the candle, and sat back. Outside, the mist thickened, turning the lamplight to pale gold. The town, like an old actor, prepared itself for another night of respectability. Purbright reached for his paperwork. The rustle of forms was the sound of civilization continuing exactly as it ought to, politely, imperfectly, endlessly.